Now that you're comfortable with the idea that Philip was the fair youth of the sonnets, right? Everybody's on board with that. Now I'm going to tell you that Philip was the Adonis of Venus and Adonis. Actually, I think the evidence for this is pretty strong. So I hope you'll give me that much, and then we can explore how that fits into the story that's told by a series of publications around the time of Venus and Adonis that give us some clues into what's going on in the political and literary world of 1590s England. Before I do that, I want to speak to the reception you all gave me in New Orleans last year. So I'd seen this Blue Boar Tavern presentation, which was in summer of last year. And I looked at those people, and that's Philip Sidney and Fulk Greville and Penelope Rich, and Gabriel Harvey is the goofy-looking image down on the right. And I said, I know those people. I study the Sidney Circle. Those are all Sidney Circle people for various reasons. And I listened to what you talked about, and it occurred to me there are some things that sort of aren't on the Oxfordian radar because you don't really have Mary Sidney on your radar, and she's part of this story. And you sort of know that the Sidneys and the Herberts, Mary Sidney Herbert, are part of this story, and I thought maybe I could share some of the things I know that maybe you don't to help clarify what I think is a really interesting moment in Elizabethan letters. So without further ado, I'm going to give you a fire hose worth of information about what's going on in this period. So all of these people are connected to the story of Shakespeare's first printed work, the narrative poem Venus and Adonis. To understand the full story, you'll need to know what Shakespeare's contemporaries made of the poem and know something about the political and literary environment of early modern England. And I will rely on literary evidence from the works and from contemporary writers who responded to them to reveal how Shakespeare's first works emerge from a literary and political conflict between members of the Sidney Circle, particularly Fulk Greville and John Florio, who divided over support for Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in the early 1590s. So on April 18th of 1593, London printer Richard Field registered a book entitled Venus and Adonis with the Stationers' Guild, establishing his exclusive right to publish the work. In the left margin, you can see he sold the publishing rights to John Harrison the following year. The poem was printed at least 17 times by 1640, making it the most popular work of the period. Field did not identify the author on the title page, but shortly after, he offered a quarto edition of a new narrative poem on the theme at his bookstall at the sign of the White Greyhound in St. Paul's Churchyard. Once again, no author is listed on the title page, but the dedication on the following page to the Earl of Southampton is signed William Shakespeare, the first appearance of that name in print. We know of this initial 1593 printing from a single copy that survives in the collection of the Bodleian Library, and because a purchase of the book on June 12th of that year was recorded in the diary of a teller of the Exchequer named Richard Stoneleigh. Just 9 days later, Gabriel Harvey seems to refer to the poem in his pamphlet, Pierce's Supererogation, dated April 27th. He notes, "Where that fair body of the sweetest Venus in print, as it is redoubtedly armed with the complete harness of the bravest Minerva." So the bravest Minerva is Pallas Athena, the martial incarnation of the patron goddess of Athens. And Harvey would have remembered this characterization of the birth of Athena from his friend Edmund Spenser's Shepherd's Garland from 1579. Spenser characterizes Bellona, the goddess of battle. Jupiter, her father, caused his son Vulcan with an axe to hew his head, out which leaped forth hastily, lustily, a valiant damsel armed at all points, whom seeing Vulcan proffered her some courtesy, which the lady, disdaining, shaked her spear at him. And I think most of you are familiar with the idea that Oxford or Shakespeare had taken the pen name William Shakespeare from this characterization of Pallas Athena. So when this appeared, Elizabethan readers would have immediately connected the story of Venus and Adonis with Ovid, who they associated with any retelling of stories of classical gods, particularly if they involved transformations of any kind. The story of Venus and Adonis concludes the 10th book of Metamorphoses, in which Orpheus relates stories of tragedy which spring from the uncontrolled passions of women. Most of the book tells the story of Myrrha, who conceives Adonis after seducing her father. Ovid tells the story of Venus and Adonis in just 80 lines. It wasn't just the use of the story that led Francis Mears to claim the soul of Ovid was reincarnated in Shakespeare in his review of contemporary writers in 1598. The motto below the title is from the last elegy in the first book of Ovid's Amores. As translated by Christopher Marlowe, it reads, "Let base conceited wits admire vile things. Fair Phoebus, lead me to the Muses' springs." For better educated readers, this quote tips off the primary source of the poem's popularity. Shakespeare weaves in themes and references from Ovid's works that preceded Metamorphoses, the ones that were too scandalous for Elizabethan schoolboys, including the lyric poems of the Amores, the Heroides, and the Ars Amatorian, an instruction manual in the art of seduction. Amores 115 is Ovid's proclamation of the immortalizing power of poetry. Shakespeare's appropriation can be read as his own claim to immortality, which seems pretty cheeky in his first published work, or as his intent to immortalize another through the work. If the latter, the poem is almost certainly intended as a memorial for the Elizabethan courtier and writer Philip Sidney, who is widely identified Adonis because of the manner of his tragic death. The year after Sidney died, he was memorialized in volumes in Latin verse from both Cambridge and Oxford. An Oxford undergraduate, Henry Price, was the first to connect Sidney and Adonis. "How similar is your fate to that of sweet Adonis. A beast gored his thigh with his tusk. How similar is my fate to that of sad Venus, for my favorite has now died too." This identification appears to become a commonplace. In the 1960s, Sydney scholar John Buxton identifies at least 5 other contemporary references to Sidney as Adonis in print. Another reason why Sidney was identified with Adonis was he had a long history of conflict with Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, whose family symbol was the blue boar. So you just heard Sidney was contracted to marry Anne Cecil in 1569. After her father rose in political and social status, becoming the Baron Burghley in 1571 and Lord Treasurer the following year, he arranged a more desirable match with Oxford. That marriage proved disastrous. Oxford denied fathering his first daughter, Elizabeth, and was estranged from Anne for years. It was rumored in some of the publications at the time that either Philip or Leicester was the true father. In August of 1579, Sidney and de Vere took opposite positions on the question of the Queen marrying the French Catholic Duc d'Alençon. De Vere had joined with Henry Howard and Charles Arundel, like Oxford, secret Catholics from ancient families who thought the match would revive their religion and political power. Sidney wrote and circulated, but did not publish a letter to the Queen arguing against the match. Sidney was in the middle of a tennis match at Greenwich Palace with his friend Fulk Greville when Oxford arrived with a group of French ambassadors. Oxford demanded that Sidney yield the court. He refused, and in the ensuing argument led to a challenge to a duel. Queen Elizabeth found out, called them both in and told them they can't do that, reminded them of their station and their relative imbalance, and were both sent off. Both Howard and Arundel later testified that Oxford was relieved to be spared the duel and tried to arrange the murder of Sidney. So we got a bore. Banned from the court for the impertinence of publicly advising the Queen on the French marriage and for quarreling with Oxford, Philip took refuge at Wilton, the palatial home of his sister Mary, at 18 already the Countess of Pembroke. There he wrote his prose romance Arcadia to entertain the pregnant countess and began his sonnet sequence Astrophil and Stella. Circulating in manuscript along with his defense of poesy, these works established Philip as the most important Elizabethan writer before Shakespeare. Various clues in the text identify Sidney's muse Stella with Penelope Devereux. She became family when his uncle Robert Dudley married Lettice Knowles Devereux in 1577. The Devereux children were fostered by Sidney's aunt, Catherine Dudley Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon. Denied an office in Elizabeth's government, Sidney took a post as governor of Flushing under Leicester, who was governor general of the Free Low Countries trying to break from Spain. In September of 1586, he led English troops against a Spanish attempt to break the siege of the town of Zutphen. The Spaniards had been warned of the attack, probably by a trader named Roland Yorke, a one-time companion of Oxford, who would later provide a model for Shakespeare's villains. Sidney rescued the entrapped Peregrine Bertie, Oxford's brother-in-law, before taking a bullet to his thigh. According to battlefield reports, Sidney offered his water skin to another wounded soldier as he was carried off the field, saying, "Thy need is yet greater than mine." Sidney's wound turned gangrenous, and he died 28 days later with his wife at his side. He was the highest-ranking Englishman to die from battle during Elizabeth's reign. Needing a rallying point for the nation facing the impending Spanish Armada, Sidney was honored with a huge state funeral, which elevated him to a sort of secular statehood and nearly bankrupted his father-in-law, Walsingham. However, Sidney was more than just a topical reference for Venus and Adonis. Shakespeare also engages with his critical theory. In 1579, one-time playwright and future Puritan minister Stephen Gosson dedicated his School of Abuse, an attack on the public stage and its players, to Philip Sidney. Abuse excoriates poets for their celebration of Venus, whom Gosson characterizes as a strumpet. Sidney's defense of poesy rejects Gosson and like-minded Puritans as barbarians who would exile poets from the Republic on the authority of Plato. Instead, Sidney claims for poets, and more broadly writers of fiction, the role Socrates assigns to philosophers in Plato's dialogue Phaedrus, not deceptive rhetoricians seeking selfish ends, but enlightened makers of stories which could lead men to discover their latent virtue. Socrates expresses this conceit in an agricultural metaphor, the idea of planting a seed of virtue in the ear of the hearer, as in the ears, that is, the plowed rows of agricultural fields. In the dedication of Venus and Adonis to Henry Wriothesley, explicitly references this metaphor. But if the first heir of my invention prove deformed, I shall be sorry it had so noble a godfather, and never after ears so barren a land, for fear it yield me so bad a harvest. And this is an interesting element of this dedication, because if you think about it, what he's saying is, this is a test for Henry Wriothesley, and if he doesn't get it, it's because he's a barren field. He's lacking virtue to respond to my poetry. And that sets us up for wondering exactly what is the purpose of this dedication, and is it really an appeal for patronage that it's supposed to be? So Venus and Adonis and Lucrece are the only Shakespeare works in which the author was involved in the publication. Both have letters of dedication signed William Shakespeare, which suggests they were intended to solicit Wriothesley's patronage. Some biographers think Wriothesley was also the WH from the publisher's dedication of Shakespeare's sonnets, and that Shakespeare and Wriothesley were lovers. For 400 years of determined research has not turned up a shred of evidence of a patronage or personal relationship. The rest of my presentation will consider literary and political motivations that might explain the dedication to Wriothesley as something other than an appeal for patronage. So in 1993, Charles Martindale and Colin Burrow published translation and critical analysis of a poem written by John Clapham, a secretary to William Cecil, which they suggest served as a pretext for Shakespeare's poem. And they are kind of disparaging of the poem. Their notion is that it was a pretext in two senses. One, that the poem is really terrible. It's written in Latin, so I cannot judge. But their view, having done the translation, is that it's just horrible poetry. And that Shakespeare takes advantage of being able to position Venus and Adonis in comparison to show how much better he can do it. But they also suggest that it's a pretext in the sense that it provides an excuse for dedicating, or an example for dedicating the poem to Southampton. And I'm going to explore that a little further. So Comparing the two dedications, there are lots of textual parallels that suggest that Shakespeare is looking at the dedication to Narcissus and sort of pinging off it to just make sure everybody understands that his is some sort of response to Narcissus. I'm going to claim that the reason Shakespeare chooses to dedicate the poem to Southampton is that Narcissus offers an excuse to pursue a political and personal agenda of his actual patron, Philip's sister Mary Sidney Herbert. And the target was not Southampton himself, but his secretary and tutor, John Florio. So why do I claim that Mary was the patron of Shakespeare during the period 1592 and 93? Well, during this period, their first Shakespeare plays are being performed, not in London, but in the provinces, where they are being toured by Pembroke's men. And Mary Sidney is Pembroke. Her husband doesn't have much interest in the theater. She is all about literature and writers and the theater. And there are records of her actually making payments to the actors. So Mary Sidney is the patron of Pembroke's men. Let's see. If so, the poem fulfills her desire to memorialize her brother, described in Abraham France's 1592 Ivy Church. So this is a sort of loose translation of Metamorphosis. And he positions the poem as the record of a gathering at Mary's Dowage possession, Ivy Church, where she summons writers and friends to come and tell stories drawn from ancient mythology that reflect translations of someone God transformed, or that transformed another, or some tale of a goddess that was changed herself or wrought some change in another. And that these were to be a commemoration of Amyntas, who was clearly to indicate Philip Sidney. She had an additional reason to define the memory of her brother. After the death of their primary patron, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, in 1588, the Sidney circle became divided, as some members, particularly Fulk Greville and John Florio, turned to Dudley's stepson, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, who had inherited Philip's best sword and married his widow. Henry Herbert, the Earl of Pembroke, thought Essex was rash, imprudent, and out of his depth, facing Robert Cecil, who eventually did manipulate him into treason and execution. And Pembroke's dislike solidified when Essex tried to position himself to take Herbert's office as the president of the Council of Wales. In an effort to claim the political legacy of the martyred Sidney for Essex, Greville and Florio began to publish Sidney's works against the wishes of his sister. In 1590, Philip's friend Fulk Greville arranged for publication of the partially revised manuscript of Sidney's Arcadia, then in his possession, relying on his Italian secretary John Florio to edit the text and adding introductions to each section, which aligned Philip's works with the Tacitian views of Greville's new patron. With the help of her secretary, Hugh Sanford, Mary created her own version of the work her brother had written and entrusted only for you, only to you, removing Grenville's insertions and completing the missing final books from Philip's notes. By using the same publisher, William Ponsonby, she managed to gain control of future publications of the works. Sanford's note to the reader takes a swipe at Greville and Florio. The disfigured face, gentle reader, wherewith this work not long since appeared in the common view, moved that noble lady, to whose honor consecrated, to whose protection it was committed, to take in hand the wiping away those spots wherewith the beauties thereof were unworthily blemished. Sanford's slight sparked conflict with Florio that raged in print for nearly a decade. In his 1598 World of Words, Florio replies to a later dig with a hilarious stream of insults in Latin, Italian, and English, all made on the initials HS. So you can read, I'll just read the English ones. In an English world without end, Huff Snuff, Horse Stealer, Hobbs Souter, Hugh Sot, Humphrey Swine's Head, and Hodge Sowgelder. This is a very highbrow argument. Thomas Nashe was drawn into the conflict when he provided a dedication to another Sidney work, the sonnet sequence Astrophil and Stella in 1591. His dedication, the part of the dedication which addresses Mary, says, "Most rare Countess of Pembroke, whom arts do adore as a second Minerva," there's Minerva again, "and poets extol as the patroness of their invention, for in thee the lesbian Sappho with her lyric harp is disgraced, and the laurel garland which thy brother so bravely advanced on his lance is still kept green in the temple of Pallas. Thou only keepest the springs of Castilia from being dried up." So remember, the motto on Venus and Adonis refers to drinking from the Castilian springs. He did not, so it continues, "Learning, wisdom, and beauty, and all other ornaments of nobility whatsoever seek to approve themselves in thy sight, and get a further seal of felicity from the smiles of thy favor." He pointedly did not receive the smiles of Mary's favor. However, with no direct claim to Philip's work, Mary was forced to use another tactic to gain control of Astrophil and Stella. The title page notes the addition of sundry other rare sonnets of diverse noblemen and gentlemen. Among these was a poem ascribed to E.O., long thought to be Oxford, recently attributed to Fulk Greville. Either way, it would be a provocation to Mary to associate Philip's nemesis with the unauthorized publication of his works. The important part of that was 27 of these added poems were sonnets by Samuel Daniel, which were not yet printed but had been registered by his printer Simon Waterston. At the time, Daniel was touring Italy with his patron Edward Dimmock. When he returned, Mary hired him to tutor her children and had him assert his rights to the work in return for her patronage. And because now there was a conflict over which publisher, because copyright doesn't apply to authors, it applies to publishers and printers. Since now this is a work that was registered by a different member of the Stationers Guild, the Stationers Guild called it in, and the matter was resolved by taking out Nashe's dedication and also by removing the Daniel sonnets. And in the subsequent resolution, Mary got control of Astrophil and Stella as well. Eventually, in 1598, she was able to publish all of Philip's works in the complete works, which became the standard for Philip Sidney. The next year, Daniel recounts this story in the dedication of the sonnets to his sonnets to Mary, whom he identifies as happy and judicial patroness of the Muses. "Seeing as I was betrayed by the indiscretion of a greedy printer, and had some of my secrets parade to the world uncorrected, doubting the like of the rest, I am forced to publish that which I never meant. But this wrong was not only done to me, but to him whose unmatchable lines have induced the like misfortune, ignorance sparing not to commit sacrilege upon so holy relics." Poems added to Daniel's own 1592 publication identify Mary as the ideal woman of Daniel's sonnets. In Sonnet 48, he names the river which flows through her Wilton estate. Wilton, poor in fame and poor in waters, shall have my song where Delia hath her seat. Christopher Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe picks up the theme in 1593 dedication to Thomas Watson's Neo-Latin Aminte Gaudia to Mary, in which again she is identified as carrying on her brother's defense and inspiration of poets. Delia, born of a laurel-crowned race in whom virtue finds refuge from the assault of barbarism and ignorance, who impartest now to my rude pen breathings of a lofty rage, whereby my poor self hath, methinks, power to surpass what my unripe talent is wont to bring. People who are familiar with Johnson's encomium will recognize the language here. The theme is repeated in Samuel Daniel's dedication to Mary of his Cleopatra, a closet drama sequel to her translation of Robert Garnier's Antony. Now when so many pens like spears are charged to chase away this tyrant to the north, gross barbarism, whose power grown far enlarged, was lately by thy valiant brother's worth first found, encountered, and provoked forth. So the involvement of Nashe joined the battle over the publication of Sidney's works to another literary conflict between Nashe and Gabriel Harvey. started with an unknown Puritan using the name Martin Marprelate, attacking the Church of England in widely circulated pamphlets. The incensed bishops, particularly Whitgift, promised a reckoning. Members of Oxford's circle, including Lilly and Nashe, were paid to respond. Some published under the name the renowned Cavaliero Pasquale, after the talking statue in Rome. And it's called a talking statue because authors would paste their broadsides and polemics on the statue. I'm essentially arguing that that's Southampton's role in this controversy, that a series of authors are having a conversation by dedicating their works to Southampton. Harvey's brother Richard, a Puritan preacher, responded to these anti-Marprelate pamphlets in printed essays and sermons, and the battle was joined. Robert Greene replied with a quip to an upstart courtier in July, broadening his attack to all three Harvey brothers, including the youngest John, who promptly died as the pamphlet was going to print. Gabriel was incensed, and a flurry of attacks and responses followed. Greene's posthumous Groatsworth of Wit in 1592, famous for the reference to the upstart crow, identified his first mention of William Shakespeare as part of this exchange. Harvey's disparaging the dead Greene in turn inspired his friend Nashe to ratchet the rhetoric even higher. Unfortunately, neither Harvey could match Nashe's gift for satire. The learned Gabriel's attempts to put down the younger Nashe come off as awkward and pedantic. In Pierce's supererogation of 1593, we're back to that, Harvey appeals to his gentlewoman patroness to put Nashe in his place. He summons her, "Come, divine poets and sweet orators, the silver-streaming fountains of flowingest wit and shiningest art, come, Chaucer and Spenser, Moore and Check, Ascham and Astley, Sidney and Dyer, come, the dearest sister of the dearest brother, the sweetest daughter of the sweetest muses, the gentlewoman of courtesy, the lady of virtue, the countess of excellency, and the madam of immortal honor." Nashe editor Matthew Stengel, writing on the Folger website, gives the reasons for believing that she is Mary Sidney. And I'm not going to elaborate them now, but the consensus is that if she is anyone, that she's Mary Sidney, although Nashe asserts that Harvey just made her up. The identification is important because of the quote I referenced at the start of the presentation. While not quite identifying Mary as Shakespeare, he asserts that Venus and Adonis will establish, quote, a conspicuous difference between her and other mirrors of eloquence. So Harvey's letter was dated April 27th, 1593. On May 12th, the playwright Thomas Kidd was arrested in connection with broadsides posted in central London attacking Dutch immigrants, signed Tamburlaine. Kidd was held for several weeks and apparently under torture identified Christopher Marlowe, then sharing his rooms, as the source of various seditious and heretical writings found among his papers. Marlowe was arrested in turn but released. Then on May 30th, he was slain in Deptford by Ingram Fraser, like Marlowe, an intelligencer working for Thomas Walsingham in what appears to be an extrajudicial execution. The coroner's inquest, not discovered until the 1920s, attributed his death to a quarrel over the reckoning. Shakespeare's As You Like It, first performed in 1598, contains multiple references to Martin Marprelate and Marlowe, including, when a man's verses cannot be understood, it strikes a man more dead than a great reckoning in a little room. In a letter dated 28 September 1593, Philip Henslow informs his son-in-law, Edward Allen, that Pembroke's men have returned from touring broke and seeking a new patron. I'm not going to try to read that, but after Pembroke, it appears the company was sponsored by Thomas Radcliffe, the 4th Earl of Sussex, until his death in 1593, after which the company merged once more with Ned Allen's troop, now Darby's men, as Ferdinando Stanley, Lord Strange, became the Earl of Derby on the death of his father in September of 1593, and then Derby, a potential heir to the throne, died himself under suspicious circumstances, possibly poison, only a few months later in May of 1594. And finally, in 1594, Henry Carey, the Baron Hunsdon, and Lord Chamberlain settled the chaos by establishing a duopoly for the performance plays in London under himself and his son-in-law, Charles Howard, the Lord Admiral. After his release, Kidd wrote to Sir John Puckering, Keeper of the Great Seal and titular head of the Privy Council, imploring him to intercede with Kidd's unnamed patron, who had abandoned him as a result of the imprisonment. He says, "I may still retain the favors of my lord, whom I've served almost these 6 years now, in credit until now, and now am utterly undone, without herein be somewhat done for my recovery." In Beyond the Spanish Tragedy, a study of the works of Thomas Kidd from 2001, Lucas Erne argues that both Kidd and Marlowe were in the employ of Pembroke during the period from 1591 to 1593, based on details contained in Kidd's letter, particularly a reference to a play by Marlowe for this noble's company of players, which Erne contends can only refer to Edward II, written for Pembroke's men. Kidd dedicated his final work, a translation of Garnier's Cornelia, likely begun for Mary, to the Dowager Countess of Sussex, and he died at age just 35 in August of 1594. So when Richard Field registered Venus and Adonis on April 18th of 1593, Mary Sidney was at the center of the London literary and theatrical scene. Her playing company was one of only 2 to perform at court that year, and she employed the 3 greatest playwrights of the period, Thomas Kidd, Christopher Marlowe, and William Shakespeare, to write for them. Samuel Daniel, employed as tutor to Mary's sons, had just published his Delia sonnets in her honor, and had begun his Garnier-influenced sequel to her Antony, Cleopatra, and his Civil Wars that so influenced Shakespeare's history plays. A year later, Marlowe was dead, Kidd was dying, Shakespeare and company had been abandoned and were on their way to becoming the Lord Chamberlain's men, their 4th patron in a year. Even Daniel had found a new patron by spring of 1594. Shakespeare's promised graver work appeared in 1594 as the narrative poem Lucrece. Both Lucrece and Titus Andronicus tell stories of women violated by men who take Ovid as a manual for rape. Both women die to reclaim their honor and tell their story, a motif that scholars call publishing the corpse. Orthodox academics ignore the Harvey reference in Venus and Adonis. Instead, they identify the first mention of Shakespeare's work in print in a printed marginal annotation in William Covell's Polimanteia, in praise of the great universities of Cambridge and Oxford, dated 1595. In the margin, which is connected to the reference to Delia in the text, remember Delia is Mary Sidney, we have all praiseworthy Lucretia, that's Shakespeare's Lucrece, sweet Shakespeare, eloquent Gaveston. So Gaveston is a character in Marlowe's Edward II, but which at this point is identified as a work performed by Pembroke's men. Wanton Adonis. Watson's Heir seems to refer to Christopher Marlowe's dedication of Amintus Gaudia to Mary Sidney, which makes it an orphan which needs her help. And then so well-graced Antony, that's Mary's translation of the Garnier play, deserveth immortal praise from the hand of that divine lady who, like Corinna, contending with Pindarus, was oft victorious. Corinna was both Ovid's mistress in the Amores and a classical Greek poetess who supposedly defeated her student Pindarus in a famous poetry contest. Nashe seems to have understood the challenge of Venus and Adonis and responded with 2 works within just a few months, both dedicated to Southampton. The first, A Choice of Valentines, took Shakespeare's fleshy, frustrated Venus and turned her into a prostitute who, unable to get satisfaction from her client, turns to a sexual aid. Not surprisingly, it was not published in period. It was published in, I think, 1820, but it survives in a surprising number of manuscript copies. Like Shakespeare, Nashe promises, better lines ere long shall honor thee. And a few months later, we get The Unfortunate Traveler, or the Life of Jack Wilton. We don't have to look beyond the title to see the connection to Mary Sidney, the Countess of Pembroke, whose seat was Wilton. So, let's see. Nashe's Unfortunate Traveler, a picaresque story in the style of Sannazaro or early Spanish novels, deserves far more attention than it's had to date. It's starting to get recognition as a forerunner of the English novel, and among other charms, it contains the seed of Shakespeare's Falstaff in an industrious tapster. I'll be happy to talk more about that, but not now. Nashe continued to rail at the Countess throughout his remaining works, particularly reviling her in his final work, Lenten Stuff. He reportedly died in Norfolk in 1601, but there are suspicions he continued on as Thomas Dekker, writing plays and satires for another 2 decades. Anti-Stratfordians have long suspected that the character Labeo in the satires of future Puritan Bishop Joseph Hall referred to the author William Shakespeare, or perhaps someone else using the name as a crafty cuttlefish hiding in its cloud of ink. In 2016, Ross Barber made a persuasive argument that the satire references Shakespeare, and in particular the early narrative poems Venus and Adonis and Lucrece. In fact, while Hall himself conceals the targets of his satire in his own pseudonyms and allusions, enough is clear in Book 6 of his Virga Demierum, I practiced that, to discern at least the outline and many particulars of the presentation I've just shared. He makes a clear, not particularly flattering reference to Oxford's marital difficulties. He references the battle over the publication of Sidney's Arcadia. He identifies specific textual sources for Venus and Adonis, and finally traces the development of Shakespeare's muse in the guise of Philip Sidney as Pallas Athena through the history plays, pastoral poems plays, and perhaps her psalms. Hall leaves little doubt that we're on the right track, but offers little clarity about who exactly is the author. Whatever the truth, it certainly appears that the Privy Council did not want it out. In 1599, Archbishop Whitgift ordered the so-called bishop's ban, which is documented in the surviving records of the Stationers' Company and can be observed in Edward Arbor's transcription. It ordered the censorship of satires and epigrams, histories, and dramatic works published without the approval of the Privy Council, specifically all of the works by Thomas Nashe and Gabriel Harvey. Additionally, 9 specific books were singled out for censorship. First on this list were Joseph Hall's Virga Demierum, I still practice that, and John Marston's Response, The Metamorphosis of Pygmalion's Image and Certain Satires, both from 1598. So finally, I want to turn to the question of authorship and what all of this might mean for who is Shakespeare. And I don't think it's clear. I think there's an easy answer, which is Mary Sidney is identified with Shakespeare. She's not exactly identified as Shakespeare. So we can resurrect the Stratford guy by putting him in the Sidney circle, which answers how he got an education and how he got access to all the literary works, because she had them. But it doesn't solve the fact that there's very little evidence for the Stratford man having the education to get there, being an actor, or having anything to do with the theater. So we can contemplate Mary as author or other potential pseudonymous authors. Did I say that right? So very quickly, I want to point to 2 sonnets which have a clear connection to Venus and Adonis, but which are normally or conventionally read as biographical. So the first is Sonnet 18, right? This is the one that people have read at their weddings. Let's see, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May is almost a direct translation of the last couplet of Ovid from Ovid's translation, or from Golding's translation of Ovid's story of Venus and Adonis. And it's not hard to understand this sonnet as an elegy for the fallen Adonis, and if you're inclined, for the fallen Philip Sidney. And the other one I want to consider is 33. This one is usually taken as the poet's lament for his unfaithful young friend. But the language at the beginning is almost a perfect match for Venus and Adonis' description of the dawn of the second day that's captured in the poem. And the final couplet actually clues us into what's going on here. So there's that there's that word wit, and then sun staineth. Wit's sun is the celebration of the Pentecost, 50 days after Easter. The Spirit of God descends into Mary and the apostles, and in an alchemical staining, the Spirit of God is reunited with the body of man and forms the church. So we don't need a biographical explanation for these poems if we simply read them as engaging with Shakespeare's own Venus and Adonis, read as a Christian allegory. And I'm going to stop there, and I've got like 2 minutes for questions. So.
2 minutes for questions here. Okay, good job.
Thank you. I think you covered a lot of interesting documents, maybe a little faster than we can absorb and think about them. But I want to pick up on your last point, because I do not believe that it is the correct methodology for us to approach these poems in a way that pits against themselves a cultural and a biographical explanation. It seems to me that we are dealing with a poet who is absolutely steeped in the religious and classical culture of his day. And you highlighted those last 2 lines, and I don't disagree with the reading that you gave, so far as you gave it, but I can't help but note that right before that are the following lines. Even so, my sun, one early morn did shine with all triumphant splendor on my brow, but out, alack, he was but 1 hour mine. The region cloud hath masked him from me now. Now, especially that, that 11th, or I guess it's the 12th line, has provoked a lot of commentary and debate and discussion. So I'm just wondering, how do you interpret those lines without drawing in something biographical? They seem very biographical to me, whatever they are about.
So I agree, and I understand Oxford's love that he was but 1 hour mine as a reference to Oxford's loss of his infant son. And I'm not arguing that is wrong. I'm arguing that almost all of the language here is pretty conventional for describing that period, the 50 days when God's Spirit is lost to man, as being clouded. I can give you references. So it doesn't need to be read biographically. If I go back to 18, right, I believe Mary Sidney wrote the sonnets, the procreation sonnets to her brother Philip to encourage him to have a kid. She's a teenager who's already got a couple of her own. And if I'm looking for a writer who would have who would tell a young man, who would jibe a young man about masturbation, his teenage sister is a good candidate for that. And then this as a memorial poem in response seems like a perfectly valid elegy for Philip. So I'm not denying that there are available biographical meanings which lend particular meaning to how we interpret the authorship. I'm suggesting we should first start with the literary interpretation which is available, and then think about how it might work together with our understanding of the biography of the author.
Thank you, David. I think we got to proceed. Sky has a question for you, David, back there in the corner, but we're going to proceed with the next speaker.